This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Tamotu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations, a show about problematic faves, great trash, difficult art, and our complex relationship with art and entertainment. My name's Hugh, I'm the host, and I'd like to put in a very mild content warning for this show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good. But sometimes there are aspects to the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Read the episode descriptions for more information and do be aware of your listening environment. Hello and welcome to another episode of Reserved Recommendations. My guest today is Morgan Davie, live from Wellington. Good evening, how's it going?
It's going very well, Hugh. How are you?
I'm doing very well. We have a new puppy in the house, so I'm slightly sleep deprived because
What flavour of puppy is it? Very important question.
Oh, it's called, the people who bred it called it a Cavador, so it's a Labrador Cavalier Spaniel cross. So if you imagine sort of a golden retriever coloured Labrador looking thing, but with bigger ears and a snubbier nose and that kind of slightly crinkly spaniel face with the like, you've done something awful to me and the world is a terrible place eyes that spaniels can do.
Very, very good.
Yes, yeah, no, it is very good, but tending to cause a lack of sleep. Now, dogs aside, the thing that you were keen to talk about today is the 2013 movie Under the Skin, directed by Jonathan Glazer, which I saw a while ago and didn't manage to rewatch, but I remember being kind of the epitome of a reserved recommendation because it's stuck in my brain to this day. But I tried to watch it with my wife, Renee, who is a wonderful person and good at many things, but crashed out, I think, in the first half hour of the movie. And I mentioned that I was going to have this conversation to her, and she said, Did I watch that? And I kind of described it a little bit. She went, oh, yeah, I remember that I fell asleep. So I guess the first question is, why are we recommending this movie that sends people to sleep?
Well, I think I'm certainly not alone in thinking that it's worthy of a great amount of interest. It won lots of critical acclaim, and it was one of those classic movies that a great number of critics adored, and film festival programmers loved it, and festival attendees kind of voted for it as their best film of the festival. But it didn't make a lot of money back at the box office. It kind of bounced off the wider audience quite thoroughly, and when you go and look online, you'll see that the kind of user reviews are very there's like a real U-shape to it. So there's a lot of 5-star reviews, but there's also a lot of 1-star reviews. A lot of people just did not connect with this film at all, but I'm firmly in that 5-star camp. I think that it's a really interesting film. There's a lot to talk about, and I really enjoy it. But not for everyone.
No, and I mean it's kind of a tragedy because it was a very big bet by Jonathan Glazer. I went and did some reading to make up for not having been able to rewatch it, and he was in production of the script, I think, for 10 years, cutting it down from, because it's an adaptation of a novel by a guy called Michel Faber, who's a Dutch guy who settled in Scotland, and that's quite detailed about who the alien is and what she's doing and why. And it was pared back from something that was supposed to be very like that and very effects heavy until to the movie that we got over the course of 10 years.
Yeah, you've obviously done a bit more reading into the background than I think I have. I certainly know about the novel, and a good friend of mine has got and read that novel, and I saw the film with him, and we both loved the film, and then he read the book and told me that it's a very, very different experience to the film. It's obviously has its own merits. It was put up for adaptation, so there's a lot of good in that book. But yeah, it sounds like it's a very different experience to watching this film.
Certainly it is. Well, I'm assuming it is. I haven't read it. I looked up its existence because I went, that sounds very different from the movie. So I guess one angle to come at it from is to maybe be straight up about the reservedness of the recommendation. This is not a quick movie.
No. It's the temperature of this film, I think, is low, and that comes across in lots of ways. Visually, there's lots of blues in the color palette. The music is quite downbeat throughout, and all of the scenes kind of play out in a very methodical way. Even at moments when characters' heartbeats might be racing, the film is ultimately built around a seduction scene after seduction scene, and those scenes are kind of presented in this very chilly, methodical, analytical way that yes, so very slow, very deliberately paced, and kind of resists any sense of urgency that the audience may have to get any resolution or revelation even about what is happening and what is going to happen next. It's just forces you to go step by step by step through this slow process.
And the way it's shot does that as well, because it uses a lot of hidden camera shots, which is another interesting thing we can talk about in a bit maybe. But when it's not doing that, it tends to have the camera way, way back from whatever's going on. And so you're watching these events in beautiful Scottish scenery that makes me nostalgic for my youth, but at a great remove without ever quite feeling like you can be in them, you know.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I also have a great connection to this kind of Scottish environment. I lived over in Scotland for a good few years as an adult, and seeing those landscapes and the environments in Glasgow is kind of it's heartwarming to me. But I need to make an effort to get my heart warmed by these very distant images that are being presented on the screens.
So, I mean, what do you think is the agenda there then? Because you used the word deliberate before, and I think that's a very good word for the movie, because it does it has a place it's going, and it sets kind of a trap for the character, and it moves her along a track into it, almost like, you know, the Greek tragedy where you can, everyone else can see what's going on and the person cannot help but walk themselves into the thing. But I mean, to put that much deliberation into doing something that specific, you kind of have to have a goal. Do you have ideas about what you reckon the goal is?
I'd say that I do, but not. I'm not kind of able to put it into ready words at this point in the conversation. Maybe talking it out, I'll be able to get to some nice summation. But I certainly feel like I've got some pretty clear ideas about what's at play in the film.
I guess one way of trying to approach what we think Jonathan Glazer might be trying to do might be to talk about some of the techniques. And the thing that I was really struck by was the use, when I reminded myself of it, was the use of hidden cameras and people who were often just random people off the street. So if people aren't familiar with the movie, as Morgan said, the first kind of half of it is Scarlett Johansson cruising around the streets of various Scottish towns in a van, attempting to get literally random men off the street, I think, because I think they were pretty much just picked up and then asked for their permission later to get her to join her in the van, so that her character, who is an alien, can do terrible things to them. But for the start, it really is just it reminded me of the kind of YouTube channel that will do things to people in public and then say this is a social experiment, but if you did that as art.
That's a really interesting take. I hadn't made that connection at all, but I can definitely see it. What I remember about the hidden camera aspect was it was very, very prominent in the marketing of that film. It was kind of the main talking point in every news article that you saw about it, and every interview that popped up. People talked about this fact that they were sending Scarlett Johansson, who at that time was, of course, hugely famous from the Marvel movies. That was kind of peak fame for her, and they were like putting her in an unconvincing wig and sitting her in a van and just sitting her driving through suburban Glasgow to talk to random people out the window. And yeah, as you say, they would check in with these people afterwards and see if they would permit their conversations to be used on screen. And I've heard that some of the extended sequences that follow what happens when she takes men back to this house to pursue her alien agenda with them, that they were also non-actors who not only agreed to let themselves be used, but agreed to dive into what followed, which is quite confrontational stuff. So I don't know if I entirely believe that because of some of the things that you see later on from these people, but they were certainly very committed to getting this very kind of authentic engagement with people who don't have any of those affectations of being actors, being performers, being used to a camera, or even knowing that the camera was there. The connection with that kind of YouTube stunt social experiment stuff is very, very interesting to me. And thinking about it, I think that absolutely nails some of what's going on there, because there is a social experiment angle to what the film is doing. It's looking at, in kind of the procedures that it's exploring, the idea of seduction and the idea of what men think and do when they interact with a woman. And that's like the premise of these aliens that Scarlett Johansson's character is representing, is I'm going to present as this attractive woman, even though I'm not. Under the skin, from the title, is this other alien form. And just the fact that I'm wearing the skin and I will smile and trot out some kind of canned lines of interaction, is that going to be all that I need to do in order to lure men over and over again into my alien machinery? And so there's a real examination. Maybe this is already coming to the point that you were saying about what the goal was, is an exploration of how kind of the male gaze is operating, and masculine assumptions of social interaction and their role in the world. All of that stuff is kind of at play, and these aliens are coming in and exploiting it, and in the same way the film is coming in and exploiting it.
I think the exploitation, in the sense of using it for an end, is a really good point to take, because I also watched some short little video segments, and the thing that struck me is that, because of course they have to use certain bits of the movie that are free to include in your short video essay or put in your trailer or whatever, and so you see a lot of like Scarlett Johansson walking through a crowd shot from behind from a very low angle, so that the camera is right on her butt, and I think that's a very deliberate choice to do that, really specific male gazy kind of filmmaking, but also have that be the point that's kind of what she's doing. That's kind of what she's for, even.
Yeah. I think that's right. It would be wrong to just say that this was a feminist film. And usually, when you talk about the male gaze, you're automatically starting to talk about things from a more feminist perspective. I don't think this is a feminist film really at all. I think it is, however, a deep interrogation of the male gaze and what it is, and kind of the social impact of it. But when you look at the film, there aren't any women characters in it. There's the Scarlett Johansson character is pointedly not a woman. She is this alien being who is presenting as a woman on the outside, and she doesn't even begin to comprehend what that means until kind of halfway through the movie. So it's it's all about men, and it's all about what men see and how men act, and kind of the limitations of that, and the kind of the butt shot, the gratuitous exploration of Scarlett Johansson's body, which again, that very deliberate tone kind of nullifies in some way. So these seduction scenes which revolve around her taking off her clothes, and again the camera is following her, swaying her backside in this kind of sultry walk as the men approach her to their doom. It kind of goes to these images over and over again, and it somehow doesn't ever really sexualize this extremely sexual operation. The remove sort of lets it have its cake and eat it too in some way. Well, I tend to think so. I don't think anyone would say this film was sexy.
No, well, I mean, it's interesting because one of the words that comes up a lot in reviews is erotic, but it's not erotic in the sense of being pornographic or turning you on. It's kind of about eroticism, or what happens if we take eroticism to bits and see what the insides look like.
Yeah.
I mean, someone who is not me and is more qualified to talk about it could probably find an interesting trans metaphor in the movie as well, about living in and being treated as an identity that you've kind of had to assume for a purpose, which is an aspect that only just struck me, and as I say, is something that I'm not really qualified to talk about.
Yeah. On when I rewatched it a week ago in advance of this conversation, and I had kind of the same thought exactly, that there is no doubt a very interesting trans reading of this film that I'm not the person to approach. But so again, to kind of summarize the plot, you've already covered the first half of the plot with your brief sentence of she drives around and lures men back to this room where they kind of fall into this mysterious machine. And then in the second half of the film, sorry.
I was going to say, and it's worth, I guess, talking a little bit about the machine itself, because in some ways it's very like what this movie is. The way it works is that she walks across a black surface that's solid for her, slowly taking off her clothes, and the men who she's seduced follow after her, removing their clothes, except for them it's a sort of steps down into a black fluid, and when they disappear under the fluid, they sit in a tank for a while, and then something suddenly sucks everything out of their skin abruptly all at once.
Yeah. Yep. It's amazing, amazing imagery. Absolutely, unlike anything I've seen anywhere else. The kind of the imagination of constructing that situation and depicting it so vividly is, that stays with you. It really stays with you.
It does, and it's I find it very interesting because it is a science fiction film, but outside of the bit at the end where you get to see what Scarlett Johansson looks like under the skin, and the sequences inside the alien machine for turning humans into whatever it is that they want to turn humans into, because that's never explained. Outside of those, it's doggedly naturalistic, but when it does those kind of completely science fictional elements, it doesn't make any attempt to have any like clear mechanism or obvious machinery or anything like that. It's completely incomprehensible the way that it works. It's just a really striking image.
Yeah, absolutely. There's it's kind of an abandoned building on the outskirts of Glasgow that these men walk into, and suddenly they're in this kind of shapeless black environment, and there's just no connection between the two spaces except for the fact that they walk from one to the other. And then there's this underneath space, wherever that is, and then there's this machinery that's doing something to the body parts, but there's no indication of where any of that is. It's just this collection of images that you're left to process yourself, because the film, I guess, it's not interested in assembling a coherent science fictional world or doing that kind of world building. I don't know if that runs against its intention, but it certainly doesn't aid whatever it's trying to do.
Well, I certainly think that's probably one of the things that made it alienating for mainstream audiences, and it the thing it reminded me of looking back at that is, do you know much about Tati?
Not terribly much. I know the name, but
so
you
he was
speak on Tati. Yeah.
Okay.
Jacques,
well,
right?
so Jacques Tati was a French comedy filmmaker. He's most known for a character called Monsieur Hulot, who was an inspiration to Rowan Atkinson in creating Mr. Bean. Hulot is this kind of giant, gangly man who is perpetually out of place and doing the wrong thing to the wrong people, and sort of bumbles through life perpetually. And there's a lot of physical comedy about that. The reason that I was reminded of Jacques Tati is that he had a lot of success and was finally given total creative control to make exactly whatever the movie was that he wanted. And what he did with that money and creative control was build an enormous facsimile city where the facades of the buildings were all on rails so that you could push them around to reconfigure the city for different shots, and then make this, I can't remember the name of the movie now, but make this movie where these scenes just unfold, and they're painstakingly choreographed bits of comedy mayhem, or sometimes kind of satirical observations rather than wacky slapstick stuff. But it's all done at this incredibly long remove, and you're expected as an audience member to kind of sit there yourself and watch around the frame, because he doesn't really have much depth of field, and decide what bit of the movie that you're interested in at any given point of the time. And there's nothing at all to guide you as to what that bit should be. And so it's fascinating, and it's clearly him doing like the peak of the thing that he was interested in doing, but also it 100% bounced off audiences and utterly ruined him, because he'd spent all of this money literally building a city to shoot it in.
That sounds amazing. I'm really interested in seeing that.
I'll have to remind myself of what it's called so that I can tell you which one it is. It might be Playtime, possibly. Anyway, if you look up Tati, you will find out which one it is. It's the one that cost us bazillion francs and ruined him.
I'm sure Wiki will tell me.
But I guess the thing that seemed like a relationship between this movie and that movie is that they both bet really large on having the audience have the patience to let the movie do its thing at its own pace, without the movie having to be concerned about like leading them through it. And in both cases, I feel like that's what makes them fascinating for me, but I'm not a typical movie watcher necessarily. And so I think it's probably the thing that contributes to their commercial downfall.
Yeah. Well, that is quite interesting to me, because every filmmaker has things that they care about and they want to explore and put on the screen in some detail, and the things that they don't care about and are willing to just kind of hand wave away. And sometimes this huge rise in kind of YouTube explainer videos and what these films got wrong videos is that in a lot of mainstream film, that's kind of the finer details of the plot are of no particular concern to a lot of filmmakers. They just want to get to the next big action sequence, and they will move the action figures around the play set however they need in order to get that big moment. And audiences are usually quite happy to go along with that, because in each of those sequences it's very clear what you're meant to look at, and the fact that this character is trying to get across that wall to the other side of the screen is very clear and easy to follow. And so the bigger picture is a bit more it's expendable, I suppose. But when you have a filmmaker who is more concerned about something that's kind of unseen and the more unseen structure, those gaps where the audience is not given something to hold on to can be very challenging, very challenging for even the most well-intentioned audience, who can get really frustrated that they're just kind of being toyed with or laughed at even. And I'm sure that there are people who bounce stuff under the skin for exactly that reason, that this filmmaker was fundamentally just wasting their time by not explaining anything of what he was doing. So yeah.
Oh no, I think it's fair enough. I think the trick of trying to use something in order to comment on it is a very tricky line to walk as well. So, I mean, we talked earlier about the way that the movie engages with the male gaze and with Scarlett Johansson, who is, a very attractive woman and was at the, as you say, at the peak of star power. So that's yet more heightened, and you trying to use that to reflexively comment on the thing that it's also doing is a tricky road to walk. And I could see how that could be alienating for people as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's not actually one of the criticisms that I've much heard of this film, but I think, as you say, it's absolutely vulnerable to it. And maybe the reason that it's dodged it is kind of because it never appears to pat itself on the back for being so aware of what it's doing. It never rewards itself for kind of only doing the male gaze ironically, or only doing the male gaze to comment on it. It's kind of it's this kind of, that surgical coldness to it somehow inoculates it from the feeling that it's utterly self-indulgent, I guess. I'm sure some people do find it that way, but I certainly didn't get that vibe from it at all. I just find it very fascinating, that combination of the coldness and the erotic, as you say, in the context of looking at how men sexualize women. I think it's a really interesting combination, and it found some really fascinating stuff to say.
So we are at about a halfway point. So what we're going to do is take a quick break for some station messages, and we'll be back right after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate. If you're a fan of NPR, listening to our podcasts and live stream has never been easier. Just search for accessmedia.nz on the App Store or Google Play and download the app with the kiwi fruit logo. Once you've got it, pick Manawatu People's Radio from the list of stations and go find your new favourite show.
And we're back on Reserved Recommendations. I am talking to Morgan Davie about the movie Under the Skin, which is cold and somewhat alienating, and yet all about kind of human sexuality and how it, and specifically male human sexuality and how it works and how it can be manipulated. Another angle that we haven't really touched on is that Scarlett Johansson's character in the movie is actually part of a larger kind of machine or organization. And again, like pretty much everything in the movie, it's not fully explained what that is or what its goals are, but she's clearly someone who's doing a job and has a support team around her to help her do that job, and they tell her when they think she's going off track and not sticking on task. And I think that's another really interesting aspect of it, because part of the repetition of the kind of seduction scenes that we talked about feel to me like they're kind of hammering home that this is a job. This is a thing that she does over and over and over again.
Yeah. Well, I would go further actually than say that it's a job. I really get the impression that she is part of the machine, that the Scarlett Johansson alien is not the same manner of being as the other main figure that we see, this guy on a motorcycle who kind of zooms around and cleans up after her. He seems to have a lot more autonomy, and he obviously has a decision-making power. He checks up on her and he inspects her and looks into her eye, like checking for malfunctions, whereas she seems very very simplistic in the kinds of things that she does and the way that she reflects on herself. And so the big turning point kind of halfway through the film where she breaks with expectation and goes off by herself is it's kind of literalized in a very on the nose way, where she stares at herself in a mirror and kind of seems to take in her own existence in a new way, in a different way. So it's this kind of layer of awakening is what I'm seeing with her character that leads us into the second half, as opposed to kind of a someone who's doing a job and then becomes disillusioned or morally uncomfortable or whatever other motivation there might be. That's how I read it anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that sense of a machine that is designed to do a thing and functions in a particular way holds, because the thing that begins her kind of spinning out of the machine and heading off on her own path to her eventual fate is that she meets a person where she has a genuine kind of social connection with them, rather than the more superficial physical connection that she's been trying to build. And that's I guess if you wanted like a nerdy sci-fi term, like it's an out of context problem for her. It's not a thing that she's got a frame for.
Yeah, I think that is exactly right. So that's a really interesting moment in the film. They use an actor who has a facial, I think it's a number of tumors that have grown on his face. So his face looks quite shockingly strange when you first see it. And he's not an actor. He was recruited. No, I think he had done some acting, but certainly he was.
I think he's a TV producer who's been on TV because he was kind of adjacent to TV and they wanted to talk to him about his condition for a documentary or something. I don't think that he'd ever been an actor previous to that.
Yeah, so the filmmakers, they knew that they wanted someone who did not fit the mold of this kind of typical masculine look, and therefore the typical experience of masculinity. And so they found this man and they put him in the role. And Johansson and they developed a lot of their conversation between themselves, the two actors, kind of working out what she could say that would be sufficient to kind of lure him into the environment. But all the way through, there's all these little jarring notes where you see that things that she's saying initially, they don't land with her when she just asks if he has a girlfriend, and he reacts in a very kind of a very different way to all the other men that you've seen where she's tried that line, because he of course he doesn't have a girlfriend. That's kind of his experience of life does not include a lot of those things. It would be unusual if he did, is the message that he's kind of putting out there. And so you see Johansson making her character kind of struggle to keep up with what's going on in the conversation. And then there's this great little cutaway where he pinches his own hand to check if he's dreaming. And the camera follows that and picks that up, and you see that she's kind of noticed it. And it's just another sign that it's not fitting with the programming. It's as you say, breaking these kind of expectations in these scripts. I actually, on my rewatch, I noticed that that's actually not the starting point of where she goes off script. If you dial back a little bit further, there's the sequence where she follows a man into a nightclub, and on her way into the nightclub, this big gaggle of women grab her, and they're all talking at her over and over. You can't really hear what they're saying because they're all talking on top of each other, and it's the soundtrack is kind of mixed out a little bit. So it's just noise, but she's surrounded by these women, and they just kind of adopt her. And they put arms around her, and they walk her into the club, and you don't really see them again, but it tracks with that interaction for quite a while. And then after the scene in the nightclub, you then see her on the streets again, and it's giving you her point of view of the people that she sees. But all of the people she's looking at suddenly are women. It's like she's suddenly noticed that women exist in the world, and she's tracking what they're doing and seeing this quite different way of interacting, and it's obviously making her experience a little bit different. And so building on that, they then emphasize the fact that she's thrown off a little bit by having her sitting in her car, kind of staring off into space, when a guy comes up and knocks on the window, and she looks quite thrown by it. She doesn't have a script for this. She's meant to be the one that goes out and approaches men, and there's this man coming to see her. So she makes the mistake of winding down her window, and it becomes quite a unpleasant scene where this gang of men are all banging on her windows and trying to break in, and she just drives away from them. But it's just another sign that she's getting herself into difficult situations because her scripts are breaking down. And then when she meets this other man, everything is already a little bit teetering, and that just tips her off to a point where all of her expectations are broken, and she is able to question what she's doing and realize, or I think ultimately she just comes to a realization that she has identity, and she has some selfhood that she deserves to explore, and so she leaves, and that brings us through into that whole second half of the film, which is her doing exactly that, trying to see what exactly she is.
And yeah, I think that is the process that she goes through, and I think it's interesting that she kind of goes through that process almost twice, or goes through kind of two separate processes. So she goes through the initial process that we talked about, where she works out that there are other kinds of social interaction than the script that she has, and the way that women are with women is very different from the way that she's been taught that humans behave with this identity that she's been given. But she then responds to that by trying to embrace being a human for a while, and that goes awfully in basically every way.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. They convey a huge amount about kind of the way this quest is doomed, with only really two scenes that are both just painful to watch. And the first scene is when she tries to eat some cake, and she can't digest the cake. She can't even swallow it, really. She spits it back up, and the film has just done this amazing visual job of presenting this beautiful looking chocolate gâteau, and
in a very picturesque cafe.
Yeah, but it all goes very wrong. And then the much longer serial encounter that follows, where she meets another man who is not is kind of not predatory, and doesn't force an interaction with her, and she doesn't force one with him, and they kind of grow quite naturally to spend some time together. And then she approaches him to seduce him, to engage in sexual intercourse with him, and it just goes absolutely horribly wrong, because she doesn't understand what she is, what it involves, and she's not physically equipped to engage in the act. And yeah, so just two scenes, but they're both just very heartbreaking to watch. These very straightforward pleasures of embodiment that are just fundamentally denied to her.
And I mean, they're denied to her. This is a sort of an ambiguity, I suppose, but my reading of her was as an entity who was doing a job, at least initially. I think your idea of her as a part of machine is also a good reading, but you know, she's been placed in the situation that she's in for a reason by entities that want something out of it, even if that end goal is obscure to us. So she hasn't, as far as we can tell at least, and the movie doesn't lean on making it look that way, she hasn't come there entirely of her own free will to do that. There's presumably a way that she could have been embodied somewhere else, where she could do whatever her home planet's version of eating cake and having sex with a nice man is.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I'm perfectly on board with that reading of it. Even my sense of her as kind of this almost machine-like entity is, I think the second half of the film does show that she's a person, and whether that was the first she was ever a person, or however you construct it, I think there is an undeniable kind of soul and spirit that therefore must have some some other way to exist that is not fundamentally doomed if she wasn't trapped on Earth in this particular situation. Or it's hard to know exactly what the filmmakers maybe had in mind there. I suppose it's kind of a fruitful little void of meaning that we can read in a bit, I guess.
Yeah, I guess the thing that I took from it, I suppose, is that the thing that she's on Earth to do is fundamentally destructive to the people that she does it to. I mean, she's literally hollowing human men out and sending their insides off to have something done to them. I guess I found it interesting that the process that was so destructive to these humans was also, in the end, it put her in this position that couldn't help but be destructive to her as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like all I can do is nod to that point.
Fair enough. What is another angle on which to attack this movie and further recommend it to people? I guess the other thing that I was reminded by when I went back and watched clips was that one of the things that carries this mood of kind of coldness and alienation is the soundtrack and the sound design. Because the soundtrack is, I've completely forgotten who it's by. I did see that, and then
I don't know either.
The name went out of my head. So listeners, go forth and look it up. But it's this, it's very sparse and ambient, but with sudden distressing clonks and honks that kind of jar you out of any complacency that you might have had with it. And I find that it makes you kind of sit alongside Scarlett Johansson rather than in her head in a very effective way.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's this lovely little musical motif that they roll out whenever one of the seduction scenes is unfolding. That in my head I kind of associate it with like a snake charmer rhythm, but it's again very distant, and it's this very chilly kind of three enormous stone chambers away version of a snake charmer rhythm, but it ties in with the footsteps across that dark floor, and it's very, very potent music that's absolutely part of the those incredible visuals, and it makes it a real enveloping experience. It's that's what you hope good film is going to do, is to create this marriage of sound and vision. And I couldn't imagine them being kind of separated there. The sound is an integral part of making this film so weirdly effective, making its weirdness so effective.
Yeah, and I think that's if that's going to be if there's a single thing that's going to be the recommendation from this episode, it is that if you let this movie do its thing, it is very effective, and I think that's what makes the gamble pay off for the filmmaker if you buy into it. Can we talk maybe a little bit briefly about the end of the movie, because it is fundamentally a tragedy. I feel like it has that sense of a character who is, by their circumstance and then the action that they take in response to their circumstance, doomed. But I find it very interesting that it's that she's doomed again by fundamentally by male sexuality or a version of male sexuality that she's been trying to cultivate in a specific way.
Yeah, I feel how explicit with spoilers is it appropriate to go, do you think?
Okay, well, I mean, so I kind of don't believe in spoilers for a lot of things, and I feel like the kind of conversation that we've already had about this movie, which is also now like 7 years old, it makes it quite clear that it's not the kind of movie where there is going to be like a grand revelation that makes everything, that throws everything else into a different context. We're not going to have
certainly not The Sixth Sense, is it?
No, exactly. We're not going to have a third act twist or anything like that. And so I feel like we can safely spoil it because it's kind of a beautiful mechanical machine that you watch the moving parts of more than it is a roller coaster.
Yeah. So in that final sequence where she, after her failed sexual encounter with this kind figure, this friend that she made, she flees into into nature, basically into the forest, and there's a lot of beautiful shots and imagery where she's kind of just getting away from that urban environment that we saw over and over again through the windshield of her van in the first half. And she's surrounded by great trees. But of course there is humanity, and particularly men there, and she's victimized and sexually assaulted, and then the sexual assault kind of reveals to this man that she is not normal, and he responds by killing her, basically. So it's a pretty horrific set of events that are again depicted with kind of that chilly distance. So it's not, you don't kind of watch it. What am I trying to say? I didn't feel like they were trying to get a visceral reaction from that chain of horrors, but what I do think they were trying to do was kind of follow through on the thematics that have been underlying the whole thing about male sexuality, and to show that you can't really do an honest depiction of how men objectify women without representing the fact that it can lead to violence, and that men are can claim entitlement over the female body. And there are lots of reasons why including that content in the film makes a lot of sense. I'm actually not a huge fan of that ending, and having seen it again, I think I would have preferred almost to not have any of that sequence of returning into the nature. And I feel like the returning to nature is quite a beautiful aspect to it, but I really wanted more of the aftermath of the relationship with the friend that she made, and the fact that their sexual encounter did not happen at all well. I wanted to see that play out a bit more, and I wanted to get more of that and to feel something else unfolding there and see what she was doing to react to that, and having that lead somehow to some horrific tragic end would have been quite satisfying to me. And having this depiction of sexual assault in the film, although I see why they wanted it in there and they wanted that representation, in a sense, to me, that was already covered implicitly in other aspects of the film, where all the men are banging on the windows, and even right at the very beginning when the motorcyclist gets kind of her predecessor in the role of seductress and carries her body up from a little valley. And I think the implication there is that she was sexually assaulted and killed. And like, it just seems to me that there was a bit of underlying messaging all the way through, and making it explicit at the end might not have been needed, and that might make it an uncomfortable watch for a lot of people. It's content that we there's a lot of sexual assault and rape in cinema, and I think we could stand to have a little bit less of it.
I think
I don't know. Sorry, I've spoken for a bit.
No, yeah. I think that's a good point, and I think, to come back to the thing that I was saying that I'm not really qualified to talk about, but back in the first half about there being some element of trans narrative there, I think that if you were taking that reading, then that ending about being murdered by someone who's threatened by by a difference between the way that someone initially presents and the way that they are maybe underneath, that could be very distressing for people, I think.
Wow, that absolutely, that completely throws throws sideways everything that I was thinking. I hadn't drawn the connection through to the end there. That's really insightful, I think. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I think so. I mean, that is another note of the movie that is quite alienating, because that does present at the end as the kind of thesis statement about humanity and human identity. That's quite a bleak picture. And so I think taking your alternative headcanon version for a moment there, you know, a filmmaker who was in a warmer mood could have done something quite interesting with how that discussion then would play out. And it needn't even necessarily be a tragedy in the same sense, or maybe it's a tragedy in the sense that Scarlett Johansson would then become a part of a machine that's doing something that it's not supposed to, and needs to be dealt with by the process that creates the machine. I think that's a thing I would like to thank you for, because that's an interesting other angle that I hadn't thought of.
Yeah. No, that's I'm going to be going away thinking of different ways to end this film, and how each of these kind of different ways really changes the weight and the meaning of everything that's come before it. Because again, one of the reasons that people, I think, bounce off this film is you get to the end, and not only is it tragic, but it doesn't offer kind of any of the resolutions of a character arc that you might expect. She begins this character arc, a dramatic character arc, halfway through, where she sets off to do something, achieve something, and she just fails. She just hits a brick wall and is killed and kind of dissolves into the environment. And there's the machine sees that she's breaking away, and this motorcyclist is racing through the Scottish Highlands after her, and he just never finds her. And like there's no plot resolution at all. It's all just dropped away, and it just finishes and it just ends. And I found that really kind of emotionally arresting, and the dissatisfaction in some way was quite enjoyable for me. But it's it's
I
just
mean,
another way that the film makes it hard to love.
Yeah, bitter is an acquired taste. I think that perhaps ties back to the scene that you mentioned at the start, where the motorcyclist is disposing of the body of her predecessor, in the sense that maybe this is part of the process, that these entities or units that do this particular job get killed or burn out or otherwise go off the rails, you know, as a matter of course, and so they are needing to be replaced with some regularity, and that's a fairly awful thought.
Yeah, well, the idea that one shot in the middle where the motorcyclist inspects her eyes very closely, that suggests to me, and I've seen other people read it this way as well, that he's checking for signs that she's starting to go off programming, is about to run away, suggesting again that, as you say, it's happened before. It's almost like an expected risk with the people who are doing this. And so following through on, I guess kind of the trans reading is top of mind right now about the fact of embodiment, and the fact that you were wearing the certain skin is going to impact you. It's hard to exist without being impacted by the specific nature of how other people in the world see you, and the structure of your body as it moves through the world. It creates these experiences. So
I think if you were to take her role as someone who does a job as well, there's a subtle, maybe not very subtle, kind of commentary on the way that work affects people as well. For example, my job is as a sound engineer, which means that I spend a lot of time listening closely to things. And as a consequence, I will probably at some point damage my hearing, because I in order to get a certain level of nuance, you have to push volume past what's necessarily healthy if you do it for extended periods. So if you're not careful, you can hurt yourself. And I think there are jobs where people would suffer much more physical consequence than that, even without necessarily having accidents, just as kind of cumulative cost of doing the thing. That's kind of an element of it as well.
Yeah. Well, this makes me wonder if any sex workers have written about this film, because the ties to sex work seem really obvious to me. Although it's playing out as a series of kind of seductions, and there's no kind of financial transaction. Certainly the way we're given this view of how men objectify the female body is something I think a lot of sex workers would be able to speak to with some knowledge. And I think since 2013, there's been a lot more visibility of those kind of voices in media. So I'm going to do a bit of Googling afterwards and see if I can find something on that.
Well, that's an excellent idea. We are at time, pretty much. So we're leaving people with a suggested list of not specific things to read, just like, can you find this thing because it will be interesting? Is there a good trans commentary on this film? Is there a good commentary from a sex worker on this film? Is there a good anti-capitalist commentary on this film? All of these will be fruitful things to read. Before we sign off, thank you very much for having this conversation. It's been it's given me new ways to look at this movie that I hadn't thought of before. What do you do in the world? Where can people find you on the internet if they want to hear or see more of you doing things, all those kind of stuff? Plug your various things.
Oh, well, I'm involved in lots of weird bits and pieces. I think the main thing right now is a live Dungeons and Dragons show that we've been doing on stage at Bats Theatre, where comedians and improvisers play the game, and it's very fun. And we have a podcast. It's called Diceratops Presents, and you can find us at Diceratops, which is spelled like Triceratops, only there's a D at the beginning, and diceratops.nz will take you there. And there's lots of other bits and pieces that spin out of that, various writing things. But I think one plug is probably enough for anyone to be remembering right now. But there's all those more important under the skin Googles that we've got to do.
Go do those as well. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for talking this evening. This has been fascinating.
I've really enjoyed it, Hugh. Thank you very, very much. And I've certainly learned a lot from your perspective on the film. There's lots to talk about with this one, so I hope that people do check it out.
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o Tangata o Manawatu. The show is produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. You can find me on the internet at Objective Realty on Twitter, and you can find the show on Facebook under Reserved Recommendations. If you've got a reserved recommendation of your own, feel free to pitch it to me in either of those two places. And if you enjoyed the show, why not go ahead and recommend it to a friend? You can find past episodes at www.mpr.nz/show/reserved on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit radio station. If you enjoy this or any of their other fine audio programming, why not fling them a couple of dollars? Go to mpr.nz/donate for more information.